Hello and welcome back to Consumer Choice Radio here on the Big Talker 106.7 FM. We're very delighted to have Chris Snowdon on the program. Chris Snowdon is someone who's been a figurehead at the Institute of Economic Affairs in the United Kingdom. He's a prolific author, journalist, writer. He's kind of the go-to guy if you're not a fan of the nanny state in the United Kingdom and around the world. So Chris, thanks so much for coming on Consumer Choice Radio.
Hey, it's a pleasure to be here.
Wonderful. So we wanted to talk about a couple of things. First off, I do want to point our audience to your website, velvetgloveironfist.blogspot.com. You've been running that blog for a long time with great articles about all kinds of insights on the nanny state. And I want to talk about your latest article in the Washington Examiner about the drinking recommendations in the United States. It seems as if there's been a couple of people who've somehow wringed some hands in D.C. and now are trying to convince us to drink less. What's all that about, Chris?
Yeah, it's the official government drinking guidelines. It's not the sexiest of topics, and it might not seem all that important because they are only guidelines at the end of the day. You can ignore them. But I've seen this happen before. 4 years ago in Britain, the guidelines were dropped, and the science strongly suggested that, if anything, they should have been raised. So we went down to essentially a pint a day of beer was the male guideline. It had previously been 50% higher than that. A few years earlier, it had been twice that. There's just the process of these guidelines being reduced and reduced and reduced. I think eventually they'll go down to zero. I think the temperance lobby want to have a message of no safe level. It would be politically easier and better for them. And it would also be a simpler message. I mean, these guys do like simple messages. However, it does not reflect in any way the science. The science suggests that you can be consuming, certainly as a man, at least 30 units of alcohol. The current UK limit is now 14. So when I did some research and I started making some freedom of information requests, started looking at the documents and the minutes and the emails behind this process in the UK, I could see that it was essentially rigged. They didn't look at the evidence. They got some people in to do some theoretical modeling. And when the theoretical model didn't support dropping the guidelines, the people modeling it were told to change their methodology. The modelers then said there's no scientific justification for what you're requesting, but they were told to do it. They were paid a bit more money, and sure enough, the new model supported lower guidelines. Exactly the same thing happened in Australia a few years later with the same modeling team. And the system in the US is currently under review. It gets reviewed every 5 years, along with all the dietary guidelines. And in this instance, they don't seem to be trying to model their way out of it, but they are taking a very one-eyed look at the evidence. The only person on the committee that has drawn up the kind of draft guidelines, the advisory committee, the only person who has a history of doing alcohol research has a long-standing position that the guidelines should be reduced, and he's been one of a very small clique of people who have been banging on about this for years, producing studies, essentially trying to cast doubt on the evidence that moderate drinking is not only risk-free, it actually has health benefits. Anti-alcohol academics really hate the idea that moderate drinking has health benefits, but it clearly does. We have 50 years nearly of evidence consistently showing this from around the world. It's particularly beneficial to cardiovascular health, and that helps drive a general reduction in all-cause mortality for moderate drinkers as compared to teetotalers. So the process seems to be underway in the US to drop the guidelines for men from 2 standard drinks a day to 1 standard drink a day. And as I say, that it simply doesn't reflect the evidence. I think it's bad actually in the long run for public health when they're putting out advice that is evidence-free and simply not credible. I think most people are not going to believe that drinking more than 1 Budweiser after work is hazardous drinking. So it's not credible advice. It's not science-based advice. And I'm hoping that kind of more reasonable minds will prevail in the US, but they haven't done it in Britain or elsewhere.
Well, I mean, Americans are drinking more than Bud, though, Chris. I do have to say that now.
And how is the pandemic playing into this discussion, especially in the UK? Because I know that in both Canada and the United States, it's really been a mixed bag. We've had headlines that have said that let's say Canadians are drinking more than they ever are, and that's really just bad research. They're just buying more in one purchase at the liquor store or the beer store. because they don't want to go out all the time and, let's say, expose themselves to COVID-19. While at the same time, we've had some politicians, like the premier in Quebec, who they asked if they were going to close the liquor stores, and he was like, "No, I mean, you should be able to have a glass of wine and unwind at the end of the day." So a very hands-off approach, which I think was very much appreciated. But has the pandemic fueled or exacerbated this debate in the UK?
Not in the UK. We actually had our liquor stores designated as essential services before the lockdown, which was nice. Other places have taken a very different view. At one point in April, I worked out that 1 in 4 people around the world were living under alcohol prohibition. You had prohibition throughout India, South Africa, all the usual places in the Middle East that you normally have it, plus a number of other places from Greenland to the Philippines where they had various forms of alcohol prohibition. Different countries have clearly taken a different approach. My understanding of the figures, at least in the UK, and I'd be surprised if it's significantly different in the US or Canada, is there's been a really big drop overall in alcohol consumption. It hasn't been my experience. Personally, I must say, I think some people have reacted in different ways. But because the bars and the restaurants and the nightclubs have all been closed, the kind of people who only really drink when they go out have been enormously cutting down their consumption. If you look at the share price of the major alcohol companies, they've all gone through the floor. So I think we've had something like a 40% decline in alcohol consumption overall. However, the newspapers have only looked at the sales in the shops, which of course have gone up, but they have to go up a lot to make up for the on-trade. And overall it's been a drop. But yeah, I mean, across the board, really, we've seen the pandemic being exploited by some nanny state groups. So you also had tobacco prohibition in South Africa for quite a long time, with fairly predictable consequences for the black market and organised crime and so on. And even in the UK, there's a whole load of so-called anti-obesity policies that have gone through recently because our Prime Minister Boris Johnson got COVID. He was hospitalised with COVID. He fully recovered, but he seems to believe that it's because he was significantly overweight that he had such a bad time in hospital. So a whole bunch of nanny state policies to do with food have been introduced off the back of that. So yeah, I honestly thought at the start of this pandemic that the nanny state stuff would have to go on the back burner. People wouldn't care about it anymore. They would understand how trivial all this stuff is compared to a genuine public health problem. But actually, it didn't take long for the nanny states to regroup and find a way to exploit it to their advantage.
And who are some of these temperance groups that you mentioned? You mentioned the alcohol academics and researchers who contributed to this recommendation in the dietary guidelines. But are there other groups of concern? I mean, you mentioned some of the other ones in the other areas, but I wonder if there's people that we're not really highlighting enough in our media. Obviously, these are the people that are probably being quoted and maybe giving a lot of advice, but sort of who are the brand new nanny staters of the 21st century?
Well, some of them aren't even actually that brand new. I mean, some of the old prohibitionist groups are still going. They just changed their name. The Anti-Saloon League is still going. I'm trying to remember what they now call themselves, but they never went away. There's still a prohibition party, of course, in the US. I don't know who their candidate is for the forthcoming election. And in the UK, we have a group called the Institute for Alcohol Studies, which sounds like a fairly dry and academic organization. But prior to that, in the 1980s, it used to be called the UK Temperance Alliance, and prior to that, in the 19th century, it was known as the UK Alliance for the Suppression of All Intoxicating Beverages. So the true, gospel temperance movement is still with us to some extent, but mainly it's taken on the guise of public health. So you just have people who, for whatever reason, are anti-alcohol, sometimes for religious reasons, sometimes just for genuine health reasons or moralistic reasons, or in some cases simply kind of an anti-big business attitude which pervades public health. So I can't speculate on all these people's motives, but they and their policies, which are the traditional temperance policies of restricting licensing, putting up price, restricting advertising, they have the upper hand. I mean, generally speaking, in this debate, as I say, the number of people who in the scientific community who seriously doubt the health benefits of modern drinking are very, very small. but they're extremely influential in public health academia. And as I say, one of them has got himself onto the committee that's looking at the guidelines in the US and seems to be leading that discussion.
Wow. One thing I wanted to mention as well, and I think you probably added some Twitter snark around it. By the way, you guys can follow Chris on Twitter at CJ Snowdon, Snowdon with an O. One thing that has come up in the media a lot is how millennials are killing the alcohol industry. They're killing the bar industry because they're not drinking as much. They're trying these kind of new flavored drinks. My question is, how is the market responding to kind of people's different drinking habits? And how much of this is driven by government? How much of it is by innovation or thoughts on health? Because I think when I go to the store here in North Carolina, I mean, I've got all these awesome hard seltzers. I've got all these different ciders and all these like new categories of drinks that are awesome. They might not have as much alcohol as some of our traditional products, but it seems as if the market is delivering kind of what consumers want at the end of the day. And we don't really need a new government guideline to kind of guide us in that direction.
Yeah, I mean, people are drinking less for a variety of reasons. There is a slight increase also in the number of people who are not drinking at all, and partly that could be demographic. Obviously, if you have more Muslims in particular in the country, you're going to have more teetotalers. But more often than not, it's actually just people, particularly millennials, are drinking less. They're not drinking nothing, but they're drinking less. And actually, they are not necessarily spending a great deal less. So craft beers, that's a pretty good example of a category where the price per unit of alcohol, as it were, has significantly gone up. So millennials might go out and might only have 2 pints of craft beer, but it will be significantly more expensive and with a bigger profit margin. And the drinks industry, I guess, would say that they're absolutely fine with that. They want to make a profit, of course, but that doesn't mean they rely on volume. They rely on profit. They'd rather upsell people to premium brands than have a lot of people drinking a large quantity of budget brands. I mean, apart from anything else, it's a bad look for alcohol if you've got people sloshed all the time on cheap cider. Much better to have a nation of moderate drinkers who are spending more money on premium brands.
And what's your take, and this may or may not be the case in the UK, but it certainly is here in terms of consumer trends. Something that's become quite popular are kind of calorie conscious beers, ciders, hard seltzers. They'll advertise quite aggressively in terms of like, we only have 2 grams of carbs. Is that something that you're seeing in the UK? And have you done any research into like the emergence of calorie conscious beverages?
I haven't personally, because I'm not personally very interested in them. I'm a fairly traditional drinker. I don't go for the craft beer. Particularly, I like my red wine, but you kind of know where you are with red wine. That's not going to change dramatically, I don't think, at any point. I mean, yeah, it is still a very innovative field, the alcohol field, whether it's cocktails or craft beers or the kind of the low calorie drinks that you mentioned. But I don't really get that involved in the industry. I'm interested in the policy overall. It's at best a kind of a side issue to me where the market is going, which categories are growing and shrinking.
Definitely. And one thing that I've definitely been in tune to following you and a lot of your work lately is that all these issues, as we mentioned before, have been sort of exacerbated or maybe improved under these lockdowns. And you've sort of been a champion for liberal causes, little L, liberal for American listeners. And, this has been a grand debate, I think, that has become, in some places, very strange. I mean, everyone's walking around with masks. Businesses are not able to open. I know we're talking about what some of the companies are doing, but, a lot of mom and pop shops probably won't exist because of these lockdowns. What is your sort of take on where we are right now with lockdowns imposed either in the UK or anywhere else? I think you've been following this trend a lot. Is this going to keep going? How long is this going to last?
Well, I guess it will last until they've got a vaccine widely available. And I'm relatively optimistic about that. I think it will probably be sometime around spring next year. I don't have any special knowledge about that, but it seems like there's a lot of candidate drugs and a lot of the companies are pretty confident about getting at least one of them to market. However, that does leave at least 6 months, and it leaves a winter period for us in the northern hemisphere And I'm extremely concerned about it. I'm not so much concerned about the virus itself, I have to say. I think I'd rather take my chances with the virus than put up with another 6 months of this kind of thing. Our government has just announced some truly lunatic ideas, really. It's got something called Operation Moonshot, which apparently is going to cost £100 billion. And the idea is to ramp up testing so we can test something like 2 million people a day. I mean, it's just not going to happen. Even the government is not so inefficient. It can spend £100 billion building factories by winter. The time frame, apart from anything else, is simply too short. And although we haven't gone back into lockdown, and there's absolutely no reason to go into lockdown, we've got very few cases actually, although they have risen quite a lot in the last few weeks. The government's just introduced this rule. It's called the Rule of Six. And the only good thing about the Rule of Six is it's easy to understand. Just means that 6 people can gather, no more than 6 people, indoors or out, and that includes children. So effectively, a family of 4 can't meet up with another family, even in a park. And COVID marshals will be enforcing this, and the government made it quite clear that they will be, clamping down. It's insane. I mean, even if you thought that now is the right time to start bringing in some more restrictions, this particular rule, it's contemptuously stupid, and it will be treated with contempt. I think I'm certainly not alone in, pretty much having enough of this. The increase in cases that we've seen seems to be largely driven by people aged between 17 and 21 who are almost certain not to die from it, very likely not to even know they've got it. And frankly, if I was aged between 17 and 21, I wouldn't be paying any attention to the rules at all anyway. This should be the best time of their life. They've just missed out on a golden summer. We're looking at a thoroughly miserable winter. We were lucky with the weather under lockdown. It's going to be 10 times worse with winter weather in Britain. And I just don't know what's going to happen.
Why do you think so? I mean, we see polls all the time where they'll say like 70% of Canadians or 65% of Brits are in favor of another lockdown if cases rise. Why do you think there is such an appetite for what are obviously quite severe measures?
Because a lot of people are totally insulated from the consequences of their actions. We had at one point this year 9 million people on furlough. They were being paid either 80% or 100% of their normal wage, and they could just sit at home during the sunniest summer on record. You have the people who influence decisions, people, the journalists, the media class, they're all enjoying it. They're quite happy working from home. They've got nice homes. They've got laptops. If they need to go out and about, the roads are nice and quiet during lockdown. A lot of people have really enjoyed lockdown, and they haven't had to pay for it. And the fact that the national debt is going through the roof is something that's quite easy for them to put out of their minds. So if there's no cost to lockdown, and it means you can spend more time with your family and play computer games and read books, why wouldn't you be against it? We need to, I think, make people more directly associated with the cost. I mean, I don't think we should go into lockdown at all. I think Sweden has proven that we don't need to do it. But if we were to start bringing in some form of lockdown, I don't think we should be borrowing money or furloughing people. I think at the most we should say, look, if you want to stay home, you can stay home. You can get a loan from the government, but you'll be paying it back.
Wow. We're speaking with Chris Snowdon here on Consumer Choice Radio. He's head of lifestyle economics at the Institute of Economic Affairs in the United Kingdom. Chris, before we go, I wanted to ask you about your book. This is available on Amazon. We'll be linking to that in our show notes. And I mean, David and I, we're just kind of entering this. You're sort of a veteran of these fields, and obviously we look up to a lot of your writing and a lot of your efforts over the years. I think you've been an amazing, consistent voice, and really one that has brought clarity to, I think, millions of people around the world, no doubt. But tell us about this book, Polemics, the idea for this, pulling together all your articles and what that process has been like.
Yeah, I've been writing about this stuff for well over 10 years. My blog was set up in 2009. And I thought I'd pull together some of the articles that I thought were, kind of stood the test of time and were fairly amusing or interesting or useful on a whole range of subjects. I mean, about a third of it focuses on the nanny state stuff that I've kind of made my niche. But there are other things, politics and culture, and a few opinions about various random things in there. So I pulled them together, rewrote quite a lot of them, I have to say. They all benefited from being improved, gave them each an introduction just to give them some kind of historical context, and put it out as a Kindle book on Amazon, which is available for the bargain price of £2.99. Because let's face it, there is an element of money for old rope with this. Most of the articles, although not all of them, are available somewhere on the internet if you can find them, but in an inferior form. They are new and improved in this book. So if you want some light reading, go ahead and download it.
Awesome. So in closing, we'll wrap up here. But I just want to kind of highlight one thing, or would like actually for you to highlight one thing for our listeners. So Yaël and I talk about the nanny state quite a bit. You have obviously been doing it for significantly longer than we have. For our average listener, why does the nanny state matter, and why should we care? Why should they care about the nanny state?
Well, if you're libertarian minded at all, you should certainly care about it. Partly because there's so much of it around. This is something that's always on the cards. It's always in the news. It's always being pushed on us. And generally speaking, we're fighting a losing battle a lot of the time. It affects a lot of people as well. You know, some of the things that get discussed about by libertarians or by people interested in politics in general actually don't affect that many people. Whereas this, you know, it really does have a meaningful impact on people's lives when the taxes go up or the government bans flavored e-cigarettes, to give an American example at the moment, or people are banned from smoking in all sorts of different places. It has a meaningful effect. And as it ramps up over time, it really snowballs and becomes pretty scary, actually. We know the lessons, or we hope we know the lessons of Prohibition. I feel we're moving towards some form of prohibition in a lot of these areas. And so naturally, anyone who believes in freedom should be concerned about it. So I think that's kind of the main reason. It's something that it's going on all the time. And yeah, sure, having a sugar tax isn't the worst thing in the world. And there are bigger issues to fight in that respect, especially at the moment, of course, with COVID-19. But I mean, the lockdown stuff really is just reductio ad absurdum kind of conclusion to the idea that health is more important than freedom.
Wow.
And with that, I was just going to say, and beautiful way to close. Certainly strikes a chord with Yaël and I. I'm sure lots of our listeners that will resonate with them as well. Thank you again for joining us on Consumer Choice Radio. We truly appreciate it. And we hope to have you back soon.
Thank you. Yeah. Take care.